In Kant, morality stands for a special kind of obligation that binds finite rational beings simply by their being rational. Despite the widespread use of the word, it's far from obvious that morality in this sense exists at all. For when we assume certain inclinations or ends as given, it is easy to see that as rational beings, we may be obliged to perform certain action. The one that, everything considered, is the best means to realize the end in question. This is then practically necessary or good in Kant. The problem is that this notion of goodness is only relative, instrumental, conditioned, and determined by pre-given ends. And that without such pre-given ends, nothing can count as good. It thus seems that within the limits of reason alone, there is no place for unconditional practical necessity for the good in itself, and that morality is but an empty word. The main objective of the critique of practical reason is to show that this is not the case. And the solution proposed by Kant is contained in what can be called second Copernican turn. Since it has proved impossible to determine the concept of the good in advance and to formulate the moral law accordingly, namely, in a sense, you ought to do the good. Let us try, that would be the proposal, let us try instead to formulate the moral law first and then determine the good accordingly. The good would then emerge as a consequence of acting out of the moral law. Note that Kant did not abandon the instrumental model of action altogether, since every deed still includes a particular end it intends to realize. However, at least from the moral point of view, acting is no longer about achieving ends. It's much more about partaking in the universal space of reason, in determining the idea of the good. A finite rational subject is now supposed to act in a way as if her deed was no longer her private affair, but something that concerns all rational beings. And the idea is simple. If, in a given situation, and all things considered, I think it's the best thing to do something, then, as a rational being, I cannot but think that in my position all rational beings would think and do the same. If the reason for my action are, in my view, justified, then I cannot but think that every rational being would think and act the same way. I do. Acting morally is thus acting in the place of all rational beings, or simply acting rationally. I think this is a possible way to express Kant's basic idea of autonomy as a distinctive articulation of freedom, subjectivity, and reason. For it is reason, I believe, that commands the concept of autonomy in Kant. It is reason that enjoys this sovereign privilege of not accepting anything but what it by itself acknowledges as universally valid. This is why there is also no paradox of autonomy in Kant, I think, since autonomy refers not so much to jurisdiction of this particular subject, but to the autonomy of universal law in her, universal reason in her. By accepting the abiding force of the universal moral law, a rational subject merely acknowledges her being rational. It is true that this act, as an act of freedom, this is an act of freedom that one can make only in person. No one can be compelled into making such choice, if this is choice. On the other hand, one has also no freedom to choose against it, since by rejecting the validity of the moral law, she would have excluded herself from the realm of rational subjects and thus undermined the very possibility of choosing. In this sense, it is correct to say that it is only by subjecting herself to the universal moral law that she constitutes herself a subject of thinking and doing in the first place. I think that Kant is right, and that this concept of autonomy still offers the, let us say, mandatory starting point for any discussion of the good. However, there are serious limitations to his position too, and they are, in my view, closely related to his formal, abstract, and ultimately defective conception of reason. By saying this, I don't refer so much to the common reproach against formality of the moral law, at least not in its usual formulation, since according to Kant, formality is an openly acknowledged condition we are forced to accept if we still want pure reason to be practical. The problem is rather that Kant conceives of reason as a self-enclosed and self-identical realm of universal validity, which in a sense stands in external relation to rational subjects, so that they, for their part, can only subsume themselves under its laws. The so-called formality of the moral law thus merely indicates a more general problem in Kant's overall conception of reason, I think. And this problem manifests itself, I propose, in at least 3 different points. The first may be indeterminacy of the good. In Kant, reason commands categorically, but it is unable to proceed to an immanent determination of the duty in a concrete situation of moral action. The test of the typic, that consists in its possible universalization, in the possibility of the universalization of the maxim, fails, I think, to offer the usual demarcation line between the permitted and prohibited, and in Kant, no other criterion seems to be able to perform this role. This indeterminacy goes hand in hand with the fact that, oddly enough, there also seems to be no space for a genuine moral conflict. Reason not only commands categorically, it is also supposed to command univocally, so that even, this is Kant, a person of common understanding, or a child of 8 to 10 years is apparently capable of telling without hesitation immediately what the duty is. And note that this is rather a strange claim, that there is no opacity regarding the good, because here Kant, I think, flatly contradicts the most common feature of what is the human condition, conditio humana. And in my view, what is particularly baffling about it is the fact that Kant once shocked the public by claiming that there was a necessary illusion in the very heart of reason. This is the dialectics of pure reason, with the doctrine of the transcendental illusion. But now, in the field of practical philosophy, maintains that no real illusion can exist. And this, I think, is strange, and in my view, indicates that perhaps there has been a significant change in Kant's, in the way Kant uses the concept of reason. And so perhaps to get the right notion of reason for Kant's practical philosophy, we should rather go back to the critique of pure reason instead. Okay. The second point is anonymity of the subject. In Kant's view, the moral subject has no other choice but to subject herself to the demands of reason. And in this respect, Kant's notion of freedom is the very opposite of the so-called freedom of choice. This is, in a sense, in Kant, freedom of no choice. However, since reason is inherently universal, the Kantian subject is required to renounce to what is particular to her. She is required to be universal against her particularity, to make herself into the willing device of the universal in its abstract purity. And this line of thought is additionally emphasized by Kant's insistence that in order to be moral, a deed has to be done not only in accordance with the moral law, but for the sake of it, and perhaps only, solely, for the sake of it. There is therefore nothing in a deed that would pertain to her as this particular subject. And it is hardly a surprise that Kant's moral law was compared, and very shortly afterwards, for instance, by Schiller, compared to a tyrant that not only demands total submission, but also anonymity. And the third critical point is finally impossibility of the evil. The problem is again straightforward. If to act morally is to act rationally out of the respect for the moral law, and if this is the only way to think freedom positively, a series of equations follows that bind freedom to morality. Free will becomes just another name for causality of reason. Under such conditions, it is trivial to explain what a morally good deed is. It is simply a deed in which reason manifests its causal effectiveness. On Kant's view, this is always the case with the infinite rational beings, for instance, such as God, in whom practical necessity directly results in willing, sollen willen. So that in this case, it is actually improper to speak of an oath. In completely rational beings, it is rather the evil that is clearly impossible. In the case of finite rational beings, like humans, on the contrary, we must consider that causality of reason has to impose itself against the obstacles of given sensible inclinations, so that it may or may not produce the respective deed. Here we can neglect the issue of how exactly this interaction between pure reason and given sensible inclinations takes place. The important thing is that on this model, the rational subject can be held responsible solely for the morally good deeds, while the others, caused as they are by sensible inclinations, cannot be properly attributed to her at all. What appears to be a bad deed does not belong actually to her. It rather indicates that in this case, the forces of nature prevailed. The forces of nature prevailed over the causality of reason. It may seem that evil is thus reduced to a privative notion in Kant. But there is more, I think. In Kant's view, only an act of freedom which starts a new causal chain in the world can be properly called a deed at all, as opposed to an event. Therefore, if an action is rational or autonomous, it is indeed a free action and good. But if it is not produced in this way, it is no deed at all, and consequently cannot be an evil deed. Equally, cannot be evil. An evil deed is contradiction in terms. Since good and evil can be properly attributed only to deeds, there can be no evil in the world, only good, in Kant. And I think, incidentally, that this is aptly illustrated by Kant's formal definition of the good and evil, especially of the evil in the Critique of Practical Reason. Kant, I just read it. Die alleinigen Objekte einer praktischen Vernunft sind also die vom Guten und Bösen. Denn durch das Erstere versteht man einen notwendigen Gegenstand des Begehrungs, durch das Zweite des Verabscheuungsvermögens, beides aber nach einem Prinzip der Vernunft. There is also the evil is a necessary object of the faculty of aversion, according to the reason, of course. But what is a faculty of aversion? What is das Verabscheuungsvermögen? and I checked yesterday in the Akademie-Ausgabe in the first 23 volumes of his works, written and Nachschrift and so. And there is only one instance of using the word Verabscheuungsvermögen in Kant. And if you, at all, so this is hapax legomenon. And I think that this is a nice illustration, yes, that Kant does have a problem with the notion, with the possibility of evil, that this is clear. So let us, this can be a challenge to explain what does it mean? What does this, the necessary object of Verabscheuungsvermögen mean? As I already said, I think that all 3 points, indeterminacy of the good, anonymity of the subject, and impossibility of the evil, are closely related. They all, I think, originate in Kant's reduced conception of rationality. But it was the problem of evil that sparked the most vivid controversy in his immediate environment, and prompted some so-called friends of critical philosophy to propose their own solutions. Schmidt, for instance, developed a system of intelligible fatalism, according to which every finite rational being has her own specific intelligible character. How is it specified? This is not explained, but everyone has one's own intelligible character that produces her deeds, the good ones and the evil ones. While Reinhold introduced a special faculty called Willkür, needed to give its consent to either pure or pathological incentives, and thus only thus transform them into effective willing. Both proposals would deserve a closer examination because they both illustrate very well the price to be paid for finding a logical space for evil. This is, let's say, a good exercise. But they will deserve a special treatment because, also for the reason because Kant's own theory of radical evil that was later presented in the religion within the boundaries of mere reason actually combines the elements of Schmidt and Reinhold. According to Kant's new position, I quote, no incentive can determine the power of choice, this is the Willkür, to action, unless the human being has incorporated it into her maxim. An evil deed thus implies an evil maxim. Now, since in Kant's view, a rational being cannot choose the evil directly for the evil's sake, he devised a subtle procedure to make it possible obliquely. In his view, there are two systems of practical reason in a finite rational being, one based on the principle of happiness, the other based on the principle of morality. As they are both inherent to a finite rational being, they must be upheld both in Kant's view. They are, in a sense, both part of what constitutes the nature of finite rational being. The question is only how to arrange their respective hierarchy in one system of maxim. According to Kant, this can be determined only by the subject's free deed. No one, again, can determine what the proper order between the two principles for everyone, for each of one is. But since this self-determination pertains to the subject's intelligible character, Kant introduced a notion of intelligible deed, performed in a kind of transcendental past, that is, in a past that was never actually present, by which every one of us originally determined her intelligible character. If we gave precedence to the principle of universal morality, or love, as it is called in Kant, we are good. But if we perverted the proper order and preferred the principle of our happiness or self-love, we are evil. While it is ultimately impossible to tell, the sober observation led Kant to conclude that in the intelligible deed, we had determined ourselves to cherish our particular self over universal morality, and that consequently we were born with an inherent propensity to the evil. Now, it is quite clear that in the religion, Kant tried to provide an a priori deduction of the Protestant and more specific pietist religious doctrine. For instance, the idea of reversing the original choice, an idea that is in blatant contradiction with Kant's ontology, because if once the intelligible character is determined, fixed, set, it cannot be changed. There is no place for change in the realm of the intelligible. This is according to Kant's ontology as developed in his critique of pure reason. And yet he allowed for the possibility, for the necessity of the possibility that our originally bad intelligible character can be turned for the best, a change into a good one. What makes it our character, it's open. A lot of questions are here open, actually unintelligible. But I think that this is clearly, this possibility of reversal, the intelligible character, is clearly but a speculative version of the so-called Wiedergeburt that played a major role in the pietism. However, even if we strip Kant's theory of radical evil of its religious wrappings, we are still bound to recognize that it is fatally flawed, incomprehensible, actually. For not only is the intelligible deed unerforschlich, as Kant admitted, the problem is that, as in Reinhold, it can be only explained as an arbitrary deed, which cannot be justified by reason. As in the story of Adam, seduced by Eve, seduced by the snake, Kant's theory of radical evil is there just to conceal that it is no theory at all, that it does not explain, it cannot explain the radix of evil. But while Kant clearly failed in his attempt of finding a logical place for the evil, we will see that by his insistence on the relation between the universal and the particular, he hit the point, or opened a promising point. Keeping this in mind, let us now turn to Hegel. Since here the dividing lines are so huge, it is always a sign of self-conceit to make it simple. However, let us try, and let us say that Hegel's conception of evil goes hand in hand with a profound transformation of both reason and subjectivity, and the theory of action, of course, that goes along with it. In Kant, and despite the famous "I think," the thinker was often still portrayed as standing in external relation to reason, as a mere company of thought, was jede Vorstellung begleiten kann. As we have seen, this was particularly true for the sphere of practical reason. In Hegel, on the contrary, the field of reason is inherently subjectivized, so that thought always involves a thinker thinking it. Here, not only it is not the subject that uses the concept, but it is the concept that, in a sense, uses the thinking and acting subject to think and actualize itself. The place of the subject, which ultimately exists as a determinant subject, is inscribed in the very concept of reason. It is one and the same concept, as Sebastian would say. Once again, This doesn't mean simply that a thought requires a thinker that would carry out the thinking along the fixed lines. For in Hegel, reason too is not devoid of its opacities and impasses. On the one hand, there are genuine conflicts in the field of action, where not only reason cannot dictate the right thing to do, but where both options may be wrong. In a situation like this, reason must obviously take a concrete shape, and to determine what to do, it must, in a sense, step out of the beaten tracks. Handeln is heraustreten, said Hegel. On the other hand, thinking may end up in real contradictions, that is, that do not arise from an error or neglect, but are a necessary product of reason. In a situation like this, reason is pushed over the space of merely logical reasons and requires a subjective decision, a turning point of the method, as Hegel calls it in the science of logic. Let us say that in Hegel, the figure of thinking subject does not only serve as a necessary support for the so-called activity of the universal, it is also a positivation of the inherent incongruity within reason, of the excess of reason over itself. This is, I think, why, according to Hegel, the only true division of the concept is the one that divides the universal into itself and the particular, where the particular serves as I think, a placeholder of the difference that separates the universal from itself. Now, the structural subjectivity of reason helps to explain Hegel's affirmation of the absolute right of the subject against the ethical substance. Now that we discussed that yesterday, that Hegel once praised the Greek beautiful world as a perfect incarnation of the ethical community. But at a certain point, he realized that it was precisely this beauty, which according to Hegel consisted in immediate unity of the singular and universal, that caused the inevitable demise of the Greek ethical world. There was no protesting there, Hegel now remarked. And by protesting, he obviously referred to Protestantism. And, continued Hegel, a higher divide was necessary in which everyone advances to this Eigensinn, obstinacy, stubbornness, in which even separated from the existing universal, one is still absolute. In the modern ethical world, the subject knows her particularity as absolute. She knows herself as she is, as absolute. Naturally, this doesn't mean that as absolute, the subject may think or do whatever she pleases. After all, it is only by inscribing herself into the universal realm of reason that she can know herself absolute. We may say that in this view, both subject and reason, both the particular and the universal, enjoy an absolute right. And the main task thus becomes to think the two as one and the same absolute. And the complexity of this task can be illustrated by the double bind contained in the very notion of Eigensinn. On the one hand, Hegel praises this great obstinacy which does honor to human being, not to be willing to acknowledge in the attitude anything that has not been justified by thought, as Martin yesterday already quoted. But, however, at the same time, in the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel equally praises the master for having broken the servant's Eigensinn, obstinacy, again, and thus elevated her into the sphere of the universal. Indeed, to eradicate one's attachment to one's particularity, to make person into a thing constituted, in Hegel's view, a major historical achievement of the Catholicism, because Catholics pray their God in a language they don't understand. They believe what they are told to believe and so on. But this has a conceptual point. Perhaps we may now better formulate the problem. In her thinking and doing, the modern subject must subject herself to the universality of reason. However, not only is reason ridden with conflicts and opacities, so that it is hard to see what reason commands. What does it mean to do, to subject oneself to reason? But not only this, she must also subject to its command sincerely, out of her own convictions. Not to pretend to subject, but to do it sincerely, out of her conviction. Nothing less is required. She must not only say loudly that 2 and 2 makes 4, but she must think it, believe it sincerely, out of her own conviction, what the reason commands. I think that it is this constellation that opens the logical place for the evil in Hegel. Let us take a closer look. In the Elements of Philosophy of Right, Hegel introduces the idea of the good as follows. The good is the idea as the unity of the concept of the will and the particular will. As we see, Hegel starts with the distinction of the universal and the particular. The good is a formal concept of what is to be done, and as an idea, it includes a movement of its self-realization in the guise of the particular or subjective will. The particular will ought to do what is to be done, that is, to do the good. However, since it is particular, and since it has an absolute right to her particularity, it is her role to determine what is to be done. Hegel says, and now this is this famous paragraph on the evil, translated by me because I don't find either of the English translations adequate. In the vanity of all otherwise valid determinations, and in the pure inwardness of the will, the self-consciousness is both the possibility to make its principle the universal in and for itself, as well as the arbitrariness to make into its principle its own particularity over the universal, and to realize it by its acting. That is, to be evil. As we see, Hegel's description very much follows the situation of Kant's intelligible deed. In both cases, the subject must determine the proper relation between the universal and the particular. However, in Kant, the choice is actually simple and clear, so that is because they are external to each other, so that it is rationally impossible to pervert the proper hierarchy and give preference to the particular over the universal in Kant. In Hegel, on the contrary, one ultimately cannot be certain enough what would be the right thing to do, or what it is that universal commands. For first, the universal may be ignorant itself as regards to what it commands, in the sense that what is to be done may be something that cannot be made out in advance from the universal point of view. Second, one cannot choose the universal as such. One can only choose something particular, so that every action can be described as an attempt at determining the good. And third, this inherently premature attempt is in any case grounded in the subject. It stands for her determination of the universal or good. Clearly, in such situation, the subject may fail. And while having the best intention to determine the good adequately, she may realize the evil instead. The conscious, I quote, the conscious is as this formal subjectivity is essentially this: to be on the verge, im Sprunge zu sein, to be on the verge of turning into the evil. In Hegel's view, action is inherently risky, and it may fail in oh so many ways, one can say. There is a nice quote in Hegel: Der Stein, der aus dem Hand geworfen ist, ist des Teufels. However, by assuming the risk of acting, by submitting herself to this law, the acting subject is repaid in a kind that she in no other way could obtain. By exposing herself to the evil, she learns something about herself. More, she makes herself into what she is. As Hegel says, the evil constitutes the most intimate of the individual. And by acting, she finds out for herself and for the others what the good effectively is. Here there's opens on the whole theory of action in Hegel, of what acting is about. It is not of realizing one ends. It's not so much in Hegel to go after one ends, but in a certain point he says something. Wenn die Menschen sagen, alle Menschen handeln nicht eifersüchtig, sondern eigennützig, dann bedeutet das, dass alle Menschen sagen, dass sie nicht wissen, was Handeln ist. Und in my view, to act is at the end. Okay, let us say so. Handel ist am allgemeinen Werk mitzuarbeiten. This is not Hegel, a quote for Hegel, but it is a description, a definition, in my view, what acting in Hegel, for Hegel is. One final remark. After introducing the concept of the evil, Hegel devotes the next paragraph to an extensive exposition of its various grades. In this progression, he starts with simple hypocrisy, bad consciousness, and quite surprisingly ends with irony, that we discussed already yesterday, as the supreme form of the evil. How so? Why irony, one may ask? To clarify this question, I propose to compare Hegel's sequence with a parallel progression of three forms of the wrong, das Unrecht, in the chapter on the abstract right. The progression starts with unintentional wrong, goes over deception, and ends with crime. Here, the principle of division is the mode in which the sphere of right is attacked or infringed. In the unintentional wrong, two particular wills claim the exclusive ownership over the same property. And in a collision like this, at least one of them must be wrong. However, here, the right or wrong is merely a matter of fact and may be easily resolved, at least in principle, as both parties fully recognize the general framework of right. On the next stage of deception, a person pretends that something is her property despite knowing perfectly well that this is not the case. Here, the situation already becomes more dangerous, since the very form of right is misused in an instrumental way. However, even here the situation is not extreme. It can be handled, let us say, because as in the case of vice pretending to be virtue, the framework of right continues to be upheld. In the case of crime, on the contrary, the entire sphere of right is undone, dissolved, because something known to be wrong is affirmed as right. Crime is an infinite judgment, Hegel claims, that negates not only this particular, but the universal as such, the very capacity for rights. And something similar applies to irony, I propose, at least as Hegel understood it here, not in reference to Antigone. Irony is certainly not the most monstrous form of evil. However, what makes it extreme is the fact that by playing with the distinction of true and false, right and wrong, good and evil, it dissolves the very place of the universal. If the good is real through attempts to universalize the particular, and this is one of the definitions, descriptions given by Hegel, once the place of the universal is lost, the very possibility of the good vanishes. And this is what makes irony so dangerous in Hegel's view, the utmost form of the evil. Thank you.